Why was she always the one no one noticed? At 12 years old, had already learned the strange art of being invisible in a world that demanded noise. Teachers passed over her at school. Classmates never thought to ask her opinion. Even at home, where love was real but responsibility pressed down heavier than the mountain snow, she was the quiet one, steady, reliable, never the center of attention. And yet, that silence, that stillness, hid something she hadn't told anyone. Not yet. She stood by the garage window of auto repair, forehead pressed against the cool glass, watching the single truck roll slowly down Highway 285. The Rocky Mountains loomed behind it, cold, hard, magnificent. Their peaks were lit by morning sun, dusted with snow like sugar on stone. The kind of beauty that made postcards but never paid bills. For the beauty was background. Survival was the only script. Her father worked under the hood of a battered Ford. Shoulders bent forward, oil staining his hands, his face looked older than 41. The kind of older that came from too many broken engines and too few nights of sleep. He hummed a tune out of habit more than joy, because if he didn't, the silence in the garage would be unbearable. "Honey, can you help your mother with the paperwork?" he called, his voice light, like he was trying to keep her from noticing how heavy things really were. She obeyed, crossing to the back office where her mother, Donna, sat at a desk cluttered with unpaid invoices and hospital bills. Donna's scrubs were still wrinkled from a night shift at Rocky Mountain Regional, her hair tied back in a ponytail that screamed efficiency over vanity. She looked up with a tired smile that carried more strength than most people could imagine. "How was school today, sweetheart?" "Fine," replied, the same word she always used. It was easier than explaining that school was just another place to practice invisibility. Budget cuts had stripped away the programs that might have made kids like her feel less ordinary. Teachers stretched too thin to notice the girl who always finished her assignments quietly. And classmates, they compared new clothes, family vacations, things she'd never have. Fine was safer. Donna didn't press. She never did. Instead, she slid over a stack of bills. "Help me sort these by due date." So did, her small hands moving with precision, lining papers into neat rows. It was the kind of order she could control when everything else in life felt so uncertain. From the garage came laughter, bright, bubbling, untouched by hardship. Her 9-year-old brother Austin was building something again, probably out of cardboard and spare engine parts. His mind worked differently, a constant swirl of energy and imagination. Diagnosed with learning disabilities, he struggled in school, but here in the garage he thrived. Every crankshaft and box became part of his private world. "Come see," he shouted. She found him crouched beside a tower of parts and cardboard cutouts. This time, it wasn't a castle or spaceship. It was something different, an obstacle course. "Look, you crawl under here, you climb over this, then you jump there, just like the soldiers on TV. His voice was so full of excitement it seemed to bounce off the oil-stained walls. Tilted her head, studying it with the same quiet focus she gave to everything. "It's really good, Austin, like the real ones." "It is real," he insisted. "Pastor Edwards showed me a book about it. He said soldiers train with courses just like this. They learn to get strong and fast and smart all at once." His words lingered. Strong, fast, smart. Had never thought of herself in any of those terms. She was careful, steady, patient. But something about the miniature obstacle course pulled at her, like it was a puzzle she might be able to solve. Their neighbor, Mrs. Sanders, shuffled in just then. 75 years old, joints stiff from arthritis, she was the kind of woman who remembered every lesson the Great Depression had taught and lived each day with simple, enduring wisdom. She lowered herself onto a chair and peered at Austin's creation. "Well, that's quite a setup," she said, tracing the makeshift rope climb with her weathered fingers. "My Harold used to say, athletes don't compete against people, they compete against their own limits." "What made him so good?" asked, surprising even herself. "Patience, practice, and a mind that never told his body what it couldn't do." Mrs. Sanders's eyes found, and for a moment it felt like the old woman was seeing something herself hadn't dared to look at. The question hung heavy. Was she thinking about athletics? "I don't know," murmured. but the truth was already pressing at the edges of her silence. Later that evening, as the locked up the shop mentioned that Pastor Edwards had stopped by. He was starting a youth program at the community center. Physical training, teamwork, discipline, and, most importantly, it didn't cost anything. "Maybe you should try it," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "It might be good for you." Good for her, the phrase lodged in her chest. She had grown up learning not to need things, not to want too much, because wanting only made the empty louder. But something about the word training called to her. Training meant practice. Practice meant progress. Progress meant change. That night, while the town went dark, porch lights flickering on one by one, lay awake thinking about it. Not the bills, not the faded dreams that filled their home, but the possibility that the very stillness, the patience, the invisibility she had carried all her life might be something more. The next morning, she walked 6 blocks through frost to the community center. Breath rising in thin white clouds, she paused outside the glass doors. Inside, kids laughed, stretching on mats. She almost turned back. She didn't belong here, not in shiny sneakers and easy smiles. Then she heard a voice, steady, commanding, not loud but firm in a way that cut through every distraction. "Gather round, kids, my name, Sergeant. I'm here to teach you something most people think is about muscles. But it's not. It's about how you think when everything around you says quit." A man in his 40s, lean, eyes sharp but kind, stood at the front of the group. He spoke like someone who had seen things he wouldn't put into words and now wanted to hand over the pieces that mattered. Slipped inside quietly, unnoticed at first, until his gaze found her. "Miss," he said, as though he already knew her name, "you seem ready to listen." She blinked, caught off guard. Ready to listen? She had been listening her whole life, to unpaid bills, to tired voices, to silence that spoke louder than words. By the end of the first session, she was crawling under bars, balancing on beams, moving in ways that felt natural. Like her body had been waiting for something to match the rhythm her mind already knew. Smooth, careful, efficient. She wasn't fast, not yet, but she didn't stumble the way others did. When Sargent asked what she was thinking during the exercises, her answer came out soft but sure. "I'm trying to make everything smooth. My movements, my breathing, my thinking. Like I'm listening to what my body tells me works best." For a long moment, he studied her. Then he said words that would change everything. "That's not beginner's thinking. That's the beginning of tactical thinking. Some people spend years trying to learn what you just described." She felt her face warm. Pride, embarrassment, fear, all tangled together. For the first time, someone had seen her not as invisible, but as exceptional. Walking home later, snow crunching beneath her boots, thought about what had just happened. She had never been chosen, never been pointed out, never been told she had something rare. And now a soldier had said it plainly. She had potential. The mountains loomed in the distance, cold and timeless. But inside her, something warmer sparked. A question she couldn't ignore. What if she was capable of more than just surviving? Why did the air feel different that Saturday morning? The mountains hadn't changed. The roads were the same winding ribbons through the pines. But inside Pastor Edwards' pickup truck, as it climbed toward Fort Red Hawk's chest felt heavy with something she couldn't quite name. Excitement, yes. Fear, maybe. But more than that, an unfamiliar weight, expectation. "Remember," Pastor said, eyes on the road, "this isn't a test you have to pass. It's just an assessment, a chance to learn." But knew better. In her family, every chance carried more than itself. A good report might mean scholarships, opportunities, a door opening where none had ever been. A bad report could mean another closed road. And they couldn't afford closed roads. Not anymore. The security checkpoint rose out of the snow like a wall of authority. Guards in uniform examined their credentials, eyes sharp, voices firm. Sat in her seat, trying to look like she belonged, though her boots were scuffed and her jacket was borrowed from her mother. The world beyond that gate wasn't built for children like her, but today she would step into it anyway. Sargent greeted them at the visitor center. Even in civilian clothes, he carried himself with that precise calm of someone who had lived too long with chaos. "Good to see you again," Ready. Yes, sir, she said. Her voice was steady, but her fingers curled tight around the strap of her bag. The training facility stretched farther than she imagined. Rows of obstacle courses that seemed endless. Towers of climbing walls. Barriers, ropes, equipment she couldn't even name. Everything gleamed with professional precision. This wasn't a community center. This was the ground where soldiers were forged. Her first task was simple on paper. Run a short obstacle course, 50 yards of crawl, jump, balance, climb. She'd done pieces of it before, back at the center. But here, everything was higher, heavier, faster. She stood at the starting line, the world suddenly too big. Breathe, Sargent reminded. Not about beating the clock, about solving problems. The whistle blew. She dropped to the ground, crawling under the first barrier. Her hands pressed into dirt, cold and wet. The scrape of gravel bit her palms, but she didn't flinch. Smooth, efficient. She kept hearing her own words echoing back at her. Not fast, not reckless, smooth. Over the wall, balance beam, rope climb. Each step demanded focus, but each step also felt like something her body already understood. The stopwatch clicked at the end. She bent over, breath steady, not ragged. Impressive, said a voice she didn't recognize. A man in uniform approached, clipboard in hand. Captain Stewart, she would learn later. His face was carved by years of weather and worry. Most trainees stumble first run. You didn't. Where'd you learn that coordination? Hesitated. Nowhere, I just tried to make it smooth. Sargent gave the faintest smile. Exactly what I told you. The morning passed in stages, longer courses, heavier challenges, problem-solving drills where she had to choose routes under time limits. Each new layer pulled her deeper into focus. Where others rushed and stumbled, she moved like someone listening to invisible instructions only she could hear. By midday, sweat dampened her hair, her arms trembled from climbs, but something inside her was burning brighter than exhaustion. For the first time, she wasn't just invisible. She was undeniable. Lunch break, Sargent said. She sat alone at the edge of the cafeteria, sandwich untouched, watching the soldiers around her. Their voices were easy, confident. They belonged here. She was just a mechanic's daughter in borrowed clothes. That doubt pressed heavy until Colonel Susan Bailey walked in. At 52, Bailey's presence filled the room without effort. Her uniform carried decades of authority, but her eyes studied people with precision that made sit. So you're the one making noise on my course, the colonel said, approaching with a controlled smile. Yes, ma'am, whispered. What draws you to training like this? Thought of her brother's cardboard obstacle course, of Mrs. Sanders' quiet wisdom, of the way Sargent had looked at her like she wasn't invisible. She swallowed. I like using my mind and body together, solving problems while moving. It makes sense. Colonel Bailey tilted her head, intrigued. Good answer. Most recruits think it's about strength. They're wrong. It's about thinking under pressure. That afternoon, the tests changed. Gone were the basic crawls and climbs. Now she faced shifting courses, fog machines filling the air, time clocks ticking down with merciless speed. Each time she adapted. Each time she found a way forward. Her heart pounded, but her mind stayed calm. Analyze, choose, execute. Her movements weren't perfect, but they were hers, steady, deliberate, efficient. When it was over, she collapsed on the ground, dirt streaking her cheeks, arms trembling. But the stopwatch clicked again, and the numbers made the observers exchange looks. Remarkable stress adaptation, Captain Stewart muttered. She improves when conditions get harder. Colonel Bailey stood nearby, arms folded, gaze unreadable. Then she leaned to Sargent, speaking words only half caught. Exceptional potential, accelerated track. On the drive back down the mountain, Pastor Edwards glanced at her. How do you feel? Proud, she admitted, but nervous. Everything keeps getting more serious than I thought. That's the nature of gifts, he said softly. They open doors you didn't even know were there. At home, her parents listened with wide eyes. Colonel Bailey said she'll submit a positive report, explained, voice trembling with both pride and fear. Regional command. Donna repeated, trying to hide her worry behind a smile. That sounds big. It is big, said quietly, putting his wrench down for once. Bigger than any of us imagined. That night, lying awake, stared at the cracked ceiling. She was no longer invisible, no longer just surviving, but the truth unsettled her as much as it thrilled her, because recognition meant responsibility, and responsibility meant the chance of failure. Still, her chest rose with a strange certainty. Whatever came next, she wouldn't run from it. And she didn't know it yet, but the next time she set foot at Fort Red Hawk, she would face soldiers instead of students. And the quiet girl no one noticed would be asked to lead. What happens when the invisible girl is suddenly asked to lead? The thought wouldn't leave her. For weeks now, had been running courses, climbing ropes, balancing on beams, moving through drills that made her feel alive in ways she hadn't thought possible. But leadership, that was something else. Leadership meant being seen. Leadership meant voices waiting on her command. Saturday morning came cold and sharp, the kind of mountain air that stole your breath if you weren't careful. Frost clung to the window of Pastor Edwards' truck as they climbed the familiar road to Fort Red Hawk. Sat quietly in the passenger seat, her hands folded tight in her lap. "You've been different lately," Pastor said, his tone light but knowing. "More sure, that confidence, it looks good on you." "I don't feel confident," admitted. "I feel like I'm pretending." He chuckled. "That's the secret. Every leader feels that way at first. The pretending doesn't make you false, it makes you brave enough to step forward before you're ready." The gates of Fort Red Hawk loomed once more, security guards waving them through after a glance at the clearance paperwork. This time didn't shrink in her seat. She held her head higher, not because she felt she belonged, but because she wanted to see if she could. Colonel Bailey was waiting. Her posture, as always, seemed carved from stone, but her eyes softened when they landed on. "We're moving you to advanced training today. Team leadership scenarios. Not everyone can make that transition. But if you can..." She let the silence do the rest. Swallowed. "Yes, ma'am." The facility's tactical floor stretched out like a giant puzzle. Scattered barricades, rope systems, communication stations, and live soldiers standing at ease. Soldiers. Not kids from the community center. Not fellow amateurs. Real uniformed personnel, older, taller, eyes sharp with experience. Her stomach twisted. Staff Sergeant Jennifer stepped forward, clipboard in hand. She was compact, muscular, with hair tied back in a bun so tight it looked unshakable. Her eyes, though firm, carried curiosity rather than disdain. "This is our civilian trainee," she announced to the group. "Today, she'll coordinate your movements through multi-team scenarios. Consider this a test for all of you." A ripple of surprise moved through the unit. A child? Their faces didn't say it out loud, but read it easily. This isn't serious. She doesn't belong. "Don't let their eyes distract you," Colonel Bailey said low in his ear. "Lead the way you've been trained. The rest will follow." The whistle blew. Her first scenario lit up on the coordination screen in front of her. 2 teams, 3 objectives, limited time. The soldiers were already looking at her, waiting for orders. Her chest tightened. Her voice wanted to stay silent. She had been invisible her whole life. Now silence would be failure. "Team 1, she said, her voice trembling, "move to the left barricade. Team 2, advance low through cover. Keep spacing tight." For a split second, nothing happened. Then the soldiers moved. They obeyed. The first objective fell into place. Recalculated, shifting one team forward, pulling another back when she saw their angle exposed. The soldiers hesitated at first, glancing at each other as if to ask, "Are we really doing this?" But when her adjustments cut seconds off the route, their hesitation changed into focus. By the second scenario, her nerves sharpened into something cleaner. She could see patterns like threads pulling across the field. A soldier too slow on the right flank redirect. A team pushing too fast into a choke point, hold them back. She wasn't guessing. She was listening the same way she always had. Listening to rhythm, to timing, to silence. At the end of the drill, the stopwatch beeped. Better than expected. "Well," Sergeant said, studying her clipboard, "most first-timers lose the teams completely. You didn't." flushed with quiet pride. But inside, doubt lingered. She hadn't been perfect. She'd stumbled, missed details, hesitated before giving commands. Wouldn't real leaders never hesitate? Again, ordered. The next simulation came faster, harder. Fog machines pumping, lights flashing, new obstacles appearing mid-run. Soldiers moved with practiced speed and had to keep up, calling shifts on the fly. Her voice cracked once, but she forced it steady, her words cutting through the chaos. At one point, she made a mistake, sent Team 2 too far left, nearly trapping them in dead ground. A soldier shouted in frustration. His heart seized. The failure wanted to swallow her whole. But then she remembered something Dr. Carter had said during mental prep training. Mistakes are inevitable. Leaders aren't judged by mistakes. They're judged by recovery. Team 2, reverse cut right. Team 1, cover fire. Her correction was sharp, precise. The soldiers moved, adapting instantly. The simulation ended, time still strong, despite the near disaster. Approached, arms folded. You almost buried Team 2. I know, whispered. But you corrected fast. That's leadership. No plan survives first contact. You kept yours alive. Not bad. For not bad felt like the highest praise in the world. As the day went on, the drills piled higher, more complexity, more teams, more stress. By late afternoon, her voice was hoarse, her legs shaking from moving alongside the soldiers. But her eyes burned bright. With each scenario, the disbelief on their faces faded. By the last run, they weren't questioning her commands anymore. They were waiting for them. Colonel Bailey and Sergeant huddled near the end of the field, voices low but sharp. Only caught pieces rare instinct, stress adaptation, accelerated development. Words that sounded less like compliments and more like destiny. On the drive home, snow swirling through the mountain dusk, Pastor Edwards asked, "Well, how do you feel?" Leaned her head against the cold glass, watching the world blur by. Tired, but like I did something real. At home, she tried to explain it to her parents. They put me in charge of real soldiers today, and they listened. Not perfectly, not all the time, but enough. Donna frowned, worry etched into her face. You're still a child, leading soldiers. That's not something most grown men can handle. Oil still under his fingernails, studied her with quiet awe. But maybe she can. That night, as she lay awake, exhaustion heavy in her bones, a new question formed in her mind. One that wouldn't let her sleep. If she could lead soldiers here, in training, in simulation, what would happen if one day the stakes weren't pretend? She didn't know the answer, but deep down, a whisper of possibility stirred. A whisper that one day she might have to find out. What happens when people start seeing you for the first time, really seeing you? For the question was no longer abstract. She used to fade into the background, a shadow in crowded rooms, a name no one remembered at roll call. But now, her name was being spoken in military briefings, whispered in offices, carried in conversations far beyond her small Colorado town. And being seen, truly seen, was heavier than she ever imagined. The morning sun filtered pale through the cracked blinds of their apartment above the garage. Sat at the kitchen table, books spread before her, pencil tapping against the margin. Her homework lay forgotten as she stared at the envelope on the counter. Official letterhead. United States Army SEAL. Inside, a copy of Colonel Bailey's report on her training progress. Her mother moved quietly through the kitchen, pouring coffee, her scrubs still faintly wrinkled from another double shift. Donna's hand brushed the envelope but didn't open it. She hadn't needed to. She already knew what it meant. Scholarships, competitions, military interest, Donna murmured, almost to herself. You're 12. I didn't ask for it, whispered. Her father entered, grease still fresh under his fingernails from the morning's repairs. He set his wrench down carefully, as if even his tools understood the seriousness of the conversation. Maybe you didn't ask for it, but you earned it. His voice carried pride, but also a quiet fear. There weren't people who had doors open for them. They knew only shut doors, rusty locks, windows nailed shut. But suddenly one stood open, too wide, too fast, and they had no map for what lay beyond. At school, the invisibility that had once protected was gone. Whispers followed her in the hallway. She's the one training with soldiers, the one the colonel talked about. Some voices carried admiration, others disbelief, most suspicion. The boy from the hardware store caught her at her locker. "Is it true you beat a real army course?" His eyes lit with both awe and doubt, like he wanted to believe but couldn't. "I didn't beat it," she said simply. "I just did it." Her classmate Emma smirked from down the hall. "She's probably just pretending. My dad says kids like her don't belong in military programs. They're just letting her play soldier." The words stung, sharp as broken glass, didn't respond. She learned long ago that answering cruelty only gave it more power. But inside, her stomach twisted. Maybe Emma was right. Maybe she didn't belong. Later that week, the doubts followed her to Fort Red Hawk. Training had shifted again, no longer just physical drills or simple coordination. Now she faced strategic puzzles, simulations designed to break focus under pressure. She sat before a tactical board while lights blinked red and alarms blared. Soldiers stood by, waiting for her to issue commands. Her fingers trembled over the communication device. "They're watching. They're all watching. Don't fail." "Team Alpha, move left," she stammered. "Bravo, hold position. No, wait, Bravo, push forward." The hesitation cost them. The simulation ended with alarms screaming failure. His throat burned with shame. The soldiers kept their faces neutral, but she could feel their judgment. She wasn't ready. She wasn't enough. Colonel Bailey approached, her voice steady but not unkind. "Do you know why you failed?" "Because I'm not good enough," said, eyes lowered. "No," Bailey's tone cut through the air like a blade. "You failed because you were trying not to fail. That's different. Fear makes you second guess. Leadership doesn't wait for perfect certainty, it acts, then adapts. That's what you must learn." The colonel's words should have been encouragement, but they landed heavy. Act, adapt, don't hesitate, wanted to believe she could. But in the quiet of her own mind, the echo of Emma's sneer haunted her. She doesn't belong. That evening at the garage, her brother Austin bounded up to her with a grin too big for his face. "I told everyone at school you're training to be like the special forces. They said you're a superhero." His heart ached. She wanted to smile back, but instead she felt the weight of his words. A superhero. No, she wasn't even sure she could be a soldier. Her father watched her from the workbench. "What's wrong, kiddo?" She shook her head. "They think I'm better than I am." Set down his wrench and wiped his hands on a rag. "Let me tell you something. When I was your age, my father wanted me to be like him, a miner. Everyone in town thought I'd never be more than that, but I wanted to fix cars. No one believed I could run a shop. Most days I don't even know if I can. But here we are. Sometimes it's not about being better than anyone. It's about showing up anyway." The words lingered with her as she lay awake that night. Showing up. Was that enough? The next training session came colder, harder. The instructors introduced team leadership drills under simulated combat stress. Multiple teams, multiple objectives, shifting obstacles. A nightmare for any rookie. When the whistle blew, his heart pounded. She gave commands, hesitant at first, then sharper as the scenario unfolded. Soldiers moved, the simulation twisting, alarms screaming. For one terrifying moment, chaos threatened to consume her again. But then she remembered Bailey's words, act, then adapt. She breathed, listened, adjusted. Bravo, flank left. Alpha, hold. Charlie, push through center. The movement synced. The clock ticked down. Success. Not perfect, not flawless, but hers. When the simulation ended, nodded approvingly. Not bad. You're learning to trust your instincts. For it was more than not bad. It was proof. Proof that maybe, just maybe, she did belong. But belonging had its price. On the drive home, she stared at the mountains, their peaks sharp against the fading light. Her stomach twisted with a truth she hadn't said aloud. If she kept succeeding, there would be no going back. No returning to invisibility. No hiding. At home, the dinner table carried its usual rhythm. Clinking forks, murmured conversation, Austin's laughter. But beneath it all was a new tension. Her parents tried to smile, but worry pressed through. "What happens if they keep pushing you?" Donna asked quietly. "What if you're not ready?" Swallowed hard. Then I'll have to be. That night, she stood at the window, watching snow drift under the streetlight. In the reflection, she saw not the quiet, invisible girl she had always been, but someone else. Someone who might one day lead soldiers, who might one day stand in the center of a storm and not break. And in that moment, a truth settled deep inside her. She couldn't unsee her own potential, and neither could anyone else. But being seen was a burden. Because once the world notices you, it never looks away. How far can you push someone before they break, or prove they can't? That was the question hanging over as winter deepened around Fort Red Hawk. Snow lay thick on the pine branches, the wind cut sharp through the valley, and yet the training grounds pulsed with constant motion. Soldiers ran courses in layers of sweat and frost. Drills echoed like thunder across the mountainsides. And in the middle of it all, a 12-year-old no one had ever expected was being pushed further than even the grown men around her. Colonel Bailey had warned her. The next stage would test more than agility or strength. It would test endurance of mind. Prolonged scenarios, fatigue, pressure. No single course to solve, but dozens, one after another, with no time to rest. The kind of grind designed to break down even seasoned cadets. Most people plateau, Bailey said one icy morning, standing with her hands behind her back as soldiers stretched in the snow. They rise quickly at first, then hit the wall. The question isn't how fast you climb, it's what you do when the climb feels endless. Nodded, but her stomach twisted. She knew all about endless climbs. Homework stacked on the table. Bills piling up in her mother's office. The constant hum of struggle that never seemed to pause. But here, on the course, the climb wasn't just life pressing down, it was life demanding answers. The whistle blew. The drills blurred into one another. Crawl, sprint, climb, coordinate, adapt. No breaks longer than 60 seconds. Soldiers around her faltered, their movements slowing, their faces streaked with exhaustion. Her lungs burned, her legs trembled, but something inside her refused to let go. Smooth, breathe, adapt. That rhythm carried her further than she believed possible. She stumbled, yes. She nearly collapsed once, hands shaking as she tried to scale a wall. But each time she recovered. And every recovery felt like defiance, against fatigue, against doubt, against the voice inside whispering she was just a child. By the third hour, she was running on something more than muscle. Grit, maybe. Or something older, buried deep, waiting for this moment to wake. When the horn finally sounded to end the session, she collapsed into the snow, chest heaving. Her breath rose in ragged clouds. Soldiers lay scattered around her, groaning, catching their wind. A few looked at her with something new in their eyes. Respect. "You don't break easy," Sergeant muttered, helping her to her feet. "That's rare." But not everyone was impressed. Later, in the mess hall, she heard the murmurs. Older recruits muttering at their tables, not bothering to lower their voices. "Kid's just a showpiece. They're using her for publicity. Let's see how she does when it's real bullets, not toy drills." Kept her head down, chewing her food without tasting it. Their words stabbed deeper than exhaustion. She wanted to stand up, to defend herself, but she stayed silent. The truth was, she wondered the same thing. How would she fare if the danger wasn't pretend? That evening, as the sun bled red across the snow-covered peaks, a new figure approached her on the training field. "Lieutenant Santos," he introduced, offering a hand. He was young for an officer, maybe mid-20s, but his face carried lines that came only from combat. Afghanistan, Iraq, places had only heard about in hushed tones. "I've been watching your progress," he said. "You've got instincts, calm under stress. That's the hardest thing to teach." Flushed, "Thank you, sir." But instincts alone won't carry you forever. You need systems, habits, things that kick in when your brain wants to quit. From that day, Santos became a quiet mentor. He didn't shout like some instructors. He asked questions instead. What did you feel when the fog cut your vision? Where did your focus go when you heard shouting? What's the first thing your body does when you panic? At first, the questions unsettled her. She wanted answers, not riddles. But slowly she began to see he was teaching her to know herself, not just the course. Because, Santos explained, the real battlefield isn't out there. He gestured to the course. It's in here. He tapped her temple. And here. He pressed a hand to his chest. The lessons changed something in her. She began to recognize the little shifts, the way her shoulders tensed before a mistake, the way her breathing shortened when doubt crept in. She learned to slow it, to steady it, to fight her own storms before fighting anything else. Weeks turned into months. Winter melted into spring. And with each passing drill, each simulation's reputation grew. Reports from Fort Red Hawk reached higher commands. Regional competitions loomed on the horizon. For the first time, there was talk not just of her training, but of her representing, competing. At home, the news landed like a storm. National level, Donna repeated, the words caught between pride and fear. She's 12. She's more than 12, said quietly, looking at his daughter with eyes that saw her differently now. Not just his little girl, but something rarer, something the world had already claimed. Donna shook her head. She should be worrying about homework, not competitions with soldiers. But what if this is her homework? Countered softly. What if this is the lesson she was born for? The argument simmered, unspoken but heavy through the household. Felt it in the air, thick and unyielding. Pride clashing with fear, hope clashing with worry. Even at school, the weight grew. Teachers who once overlooked her now handed her essays with notes like, impressive work. You should consider military history electives. Classmates who ignored her now whispered whenever she passed. Some with admiration, others with jealousy, a few with cruelty. Emma sneered again one afternoon in the cafeteria. Go ahead, play soldier. You'll quit eventually. Everyone does. Didn't answer, but this time she didn't shrink either. She lifted her tray, walked past, and sat alone. And for once, being alone didn't feel like invisibility. It felt like choice. At Fort Red Hawk, Colonel Bailey watched her during another long simulation. Her arms shook, her body screamed for rest, but still she adapted, still she pushed. When it was over, Bailey turned to Santos. She reminds me of someone, Bailey said quietly. Who? Santos asked. Me, at that age, except stronger. That evening, as trudged back to the pickup truck, Pastor Edwards met her with a gentle smile. Do you know what resilience is? He asked. Not giving up, she guessed. More than that, it's when life squeezes you so hard it should break you, but instead you discover what's inside. And what's inside you, it's starting to show. She sat in the back seat on the drive home, staring out at the mountains, her reflection ghosted in the glass. Inside, she felt the storm of doubt and pride, fear and hope all colliding. How far could she go? How far would they push her? And more than that, what would she discover about herself if she reached the very edge? She didn't know, not yet, but she sensed the answer was coming sooner than she thought. What if the very man who doubted her ended up defining her? The spring air carried the scent of pine and thawing earth when the convoy rolled into Fort Red Hawk. Stood on the training grounds, sweat dripping from her brow after another endurance drill, when the sound of engines drew every eye toward the gates. Military SUVs, black and polished, their presence sharp against the rugged backdrop of the Rockies. Whispers rippled among the soldiers. The general's here. Had heard the name before. General Burke, decorated, feared, known across the army for his uncompromising standards and sharper tongue. The kind of man who believed failure was weakness and weakness had no place in uniform. He wasn't just a leader, he was a storm. She didn't expect him to notice her. Not really. Why would a general, a man who commanded thousands, care about one 12-year-old trainee? She imagined he would pass her by, shake Colonel Bailey's hand, deliver some hard-edged speech, and leave. But that wasn't what happened. Burke stepped out of the SUV, tall, broad-shouldered, with hair cut close and eyes as hard as steel. He scanned the field like a predator surveying territory. Soldiers straightened, instructors snapped to attention. Then his gaze landed on her. And he frowned. This, he said, pointing, his voice carrying across the grounds, is the girl I've been hearing about. Colonel Bailey's expression remained steady. Yes, sir. Her progress reports. Progress reports don't impress me, Burke cut in, his voice sharp as glass. You've got men here who bled overseas, and you're wasting resources on a child. Heat crawled up's neck. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, but something inside her held firm. She didn't answer, didn't dare, but she didn't look away either. Bailey's jaw tightened. With respect, sir, she's demonstrated capabilities beyond her age. Tactical thinking, stress adaptation, leadership under pressure. Burke barked a laugh. Leadership? Don't insult the word. A child can memorize drills. A child can play games. But real combat, real war, that's where boys become men or die trying. And you think a little girl belongs in that conversation? The silence that followed was heavier than any weight had carried. She could feel eyes on her from every direction, soldiers, instructors, recruits, waiting, measuring. For the first time in months, she felt small again. Not invisible, no, worse, exposed. Burke stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. He looked down at her, his shadow stretching long. Tell me, girl, do you think you're ready to fight alongside these men, to face what they've faced? Her mouth went dry, words tangled in her throat. Part of her wanted to nod, to declare herself ready. Another part wanted to whisper no, because no one was ever ready for war. But she remembered Bailey's advice. Leadership doesn't wait for perfect certainty, it acts, then adapts. So she lifted her chin, voice quiet but clear. I don't know if I'm ready, but I know I won't quit. For the briefest moment, silence cracked around her. Then Burke's laughter rang out, loud and scornful. Won't quit. That's what every recruit says before the course breaks them, and it always breaks them. He turned to Bailey. You want me to believe this child has potential? Fine, let's put it to the test. Bailey's eyes narrowed. Sir, with respect. Burke raised a hand, silencing her. I'll bet you this. She won't last 10 minutes on the Special Forces qualification course, the hardest course we run, designed to break men twice her size, twice her age. If she finishes even a fraction, I'll eat my words. But she won't. And when she fails, maybe we can stop wasting time pretending she's anything more than a publicity stunt. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the watching crowd. The Special Forces course, everyone knew its reputation. Brutal, unforgiving. Months of preparation condensed into a gauntlet of endurance, strategy, and willpower. Soldiers washed out every year. Men in their 20s and 30s left broken, their bodies carried off the field. And now, a general was challenging a 12-year-old to face it. His chest tightened. Fear, yes, but also something sharper. Pride, defiance. The same quiet fire that had carried her through every moment when the world told her she didn't belong. She didn't answer Burke. She didn't need to. Her silence was its own statement. Later, in Colonel Bailey's office, the air was thick with tension. Bailey paced, her boots striking the floor like gunshots. Sargent leaned against the wall, arms crossed, frustration in her eyes. Santos sat near the window, silent but steady. This is madness, Bailey muttered. The course isn't designed for children. It isn't even designed for most soldiers. She doesn't have to do it, said. We can pull her out, tell Burke it's inappropriate. But sitting in the chair across from Bailey's desk, shook her head. If I don't try, he wins. He'll say I was afraid, and maybe I am, but I can't let that be the answer. Bailey stopped packing. Her eyes softened just for a moment. Do you understand what you're agreeing to? This course isn't about pride. It's about survival. Men with years of training have broken on that ground. I know, whispered, but I can't be invisible again, not now. Silence held for a long time. Finally, Bailey sighed. Then we'll prepare you, not to prove him wrong, not to prove yourself right, but to give you the chance to find your own answer. From that day forward, her training shifted. Harder, longer, harsher. Dawn runs through snow that numbed her feet, weighted climbs until her arms screamed. Night drills that left her eyes burning with fatigue. Santos pushed her mind, memory games, tactical riddles, stress exercises under flashing lights. Pushed her body, grueling circuits, endless repetitions, endurance runs until her legs shook like reeds in wind. Every night, she crawled into bed so exhausted she thought she might never wake. But every morning, she rose again. At home, her parents noticed the changes. Her face thinner, her shoulders, her eyes carrying something older than her years. "You don't have to do this," Donna pleaded one evening, her voice breaking. "He's a general. He doesn't care if you win or lose. He just wants to prove a point." His reply was soft but unyielding. "So do I." Said nothing, only placing a hand on his daughter's shoulder. Pride warred with fear in his eyes, but he didn't try to stop her. He knew too well what it meant to face someone who doubted you. The weeks passed in a blur of pain and progress. And as the day of the challenge drew near, the whispers spread beyond Fort Red Hawk. Soldiers spoke of the girl who would face Burke's gauntlet. Some scoffed, some cheered, all waited. On the eve of the course, stood outside the barracks, the mountains looming black against a sky filled with stars. She felt the weight of it pressing down, fear, doubt, expectation. But beneath it all, she felt something else. A stillness, a clarity. She remembered Mrs. Sanders' words long ago in the garage. Athletes don't compete against people. They compete against their own limits. Tomorrow, she would face hers. And she didn't know what would happen. But she knew one thing. She wouldn't quit. Every second wasn't just a test of her body. It was a test of her existence. The morning of the course broke cold and gray. A mist clung low over the valley, swallowing the training grounds in a hush that felt almost sacred. Soldiers gathered in silence, hundreds of them, drawn by the rumor that had spread like wildfire. A 12-year-old girl was about to attempt the Special Forces qualification course. Some came out of curiosity, some out of doubt, some because they couldn't believe it until they saw it with their own eyes. General Burke stood near the starting line, arms crossed, his smirk sharp as steel. Colonel Bailey beside him was rigid, her jaw tight, as though holding back words that would never be allowed in front of a general. Stood alone, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. Her breath curled in the morning air, chest rising steady but sharp. She looked so small against the sprawling nightmare of obstacles stretched ahead. High walls, weighted carries, mud pits, rope climbs, endurance stations that stacked one after another without mercy. Burke's voice cut the silence. 10 minutes, he said, loud enough for all to hear. That's how long I give her before she collapses. Any takers? Laughter rumbled through some of the ranks. A few shook their heads, muttering that this wasn't right. Others smirked, eager to see her fail. The whistle blew. Launched forward. The first wall loomed, taller than anything she'd faced before. Her fingers scraped against the wood, boots slipping in the damp. A soldier muttered, "She won't make it past the first." But crouched, sprang again, hooked her fingers, and hauled herself upward with a grunt that tore at her throat. She scrambled, kicked, and dragged herself over the top, landing hard on the other side. Pain flared in her knees, but she was moving again before it could root. The rope climb came next, thick and slick with morning frost. Her arms screamed on the first pull, every inch a war against gravity. Halfway up, her grip faltered. Gasps rippled from the crowd. For a heartbeat, it seemed she would slide down, defeated. Don't quit, the words burned through her. She reset her grip, tightened her legs, and hauled herself higher, inch by inch, breath by breath. At the top, she slapped the beam and descended, legs shaking. Minutes had passed, not 10, not yet. Mud pits swallowed her legs to the knee, cold sucking at her strength. She waded, clawed, pulled herself free, coated head to toe in filth. Soldiers shouted from the sidelines, some mocking, some urging her on. Her lungs burned, her arms trembled, but she pressed forward. Weighted carries followed, sandbags twice her size, logs that bent stronger men. She wrapped her arms around the weight, staggered, almost fell. Burke's smirk widened. But then she steadied, legs shuffling, step by step, dragging the impossible across the line. Smooth, breathe, adapt, she whispered, barely audible, her mantra, her anchor. The obstacles blurred together, balance beams slick with mud, tunnels that scraped her elbows raw, climbs that tore skin from her palms. She stumbled, fell hard once, face slamming into dirt. Blood smeared her lip. The crowd roared, half in pity, half in triumph. Burke shook his head, already turning away. But Rose, spat blood, kept running. Time stretched. 10 minutes came and went, then 20, then 30. Soldiers who had wagered against her shifted uncomfortably. Some crossed their arms, now silent. Others began to shout encouragement. "Come on, kid, push." By the final stretch, she was no longer just a girl running a course. She was a force of will dragging herself through pain that would have broken many twice her age. Her body shook, every muscle near collapse. But her eyes were steady, locked forward. The last obstacle stood ahead, a high cargo net rising like a wall into the mist. His hands trembled as she gripped the rope. She climbed, legs heavy, arms screaming. Halfway up, her foot slipped. The crowd gasped. She dangled, one hand clutching desperately. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. Burke's voice cut sharp. "Fall girl, it's over." But in the silence that followed, another voice rose, softer, steadier. Colonel Bailey, not shouting, just speaking as though to her alone. "Act, then adapt, you know how." Closed her eyes, pulled one breath, then another. She reset her grip, hooked her foot, and climbed, slowly, painfully, relentlessly, until her hand closed over the top. When she hauled herself over the net and dropped to the far side, the horn blared. Course complete. The field erupted. Soldiers who had doubted her moments ago now shouted her name, their disbelief transformed into awe. Even those who had scoffed fell silent, unable to deny what they had seen. Burke's face was stone. He didn't clap. He didn't smile. He only turned away, his pride bruised deeper than he would ever admit. Stood at the finish line, body trembling, chest heaving, mud and blood streaking her face. But in her eyes there was no gloating, no triumph, only quiet, only stillness. Because she hadn't come to humiliate him. She hadn't come to prove anyone wrong. She had come to prove something to herself, that she could face the storm and not break. And she had. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Colonel Bailey approached her, kneeling so their eyes met. "Do you understand what you've done?" Shook her head weakly. "You didn't just finish a course," Bailey said softly. "You changed the conversation. From now on, no one can say you don't belong, and no one will forget the moment they watched you refuse to quit." Wanted to answer, but her throat closed with exhaustion. Instead, she nodded once, small but sure. That night in the barracks, she lay on the cot, her body aching beyond words. She thought of her family, her brother Austin who believed she was a superhero, her parents who feared and hoped all at once. She thought of the soldiers who had doubted, then cheered. And she thought of the general who had wanted her to fail. Maybe she had answered him, but more than that, she had answered herself. Because in the quiet of her mind, in the place no one else could see, she finally knew the truth. She wasn't invisible anymore. And she would never be again. What happens after the cheering stops? After the dust settles, after the crowd disperses, and silence creeps back into the corners of the world? For it was the silence that weighed the heaviest. The morning after her run through the Special Forces course, the training grounds at Fort Red Hawk looked unchanged. The same walls, the same ropes, the same mud pits stretching under a pale sky. But everything felt different. Soldiers who once looked past her now stopped mid-step, giving nods of acknowledgement. Some clapped her on the shoulder. Others simply stared, as though trying to reconcile the image of a small girl with the memory of what they had witnessed. General Burke was nowhere to be seen. He had left before dawn, his silence louder than any concession he could have spoken. Too, that was victory enough. But victory didn't feel the way she thought it would. Her body ached, every muscle pulled tight, bruises blooming dark across her skin. Her hands were raw from rope burns, her lips still swollen where she had slammed into the dirt. But the ache wasn't just physical. It was deeper, quieter. A heaviness in her chest that came from carrying the weight of expectation, then realizing the weight hadn't vanished when she set it down. Colonel Bailey called her into the office late that morning. The blinds were drawn, a shaft of light cutting across the polished desk. Bailey stood with her hands behind her back, her face as unreadable as ever. "You understand what yesterday means," Bailey said. It wasn't a question. Sat stiffly, her legs still sore. "It means I finished." "It means," Bailey corrected gently, "the entire command knows your name. Burke may never speak of it, but he knows what happened. And others will too. That changes things, it opens doors, and it closes others." frowned, closes. You won't have anonymity again. Not here, not at home, not in the competitions ahead. People will watch you, waiting for the next proof, the next miracle. Some will cheer. Some will wait for you to stumble. That's the cost of being seen. The words sank like stones in her stomach. She had dreamed of being noticed once, of breaking free from invisibility. But being seen, truly seen, wasn't freedom. It was a burden. Do you regret it? Bailey asked softly. Thought of the rope burns, the bruises, the jeers of soldiers who doubted her. She thought of Burke's smirk, of the weight of the course pressing down until she thought she would shatter. She thought of the moment she reached the top of the cargo net, every cell in her body screaming to quit, and she hadn't. She shook her head. No. Bailey's eyes softened, pride flickering like a flame. Good, because the world will ask you that again and again. Remember this moment when it does. At home, the reaction was quieter, but no less profound. Her brother Austin nearly tackled her the second she walked in the door, shouting, "You did it! You really did it! I told everyone you were a superhero, and they didn't believe me, but now they will." His joy was so fierce, so unguarded, that almost forgot the weight in her chest. Her father's pride was quieter. He simply pulled her into a hug that smelled of grease and sweat and whispered, "You showed them, kiddo." But her mother's eyes brimmed with tears that carried more fear than pride. "Why does it have to be you?" Donna whispered late that night when the others had gone to bed. "Why can't you just be 12? Had no answer. She wanted to say she didn't choose this path, that it had chosen her, but the words felt hollow. Because deep down she knew when Burke had challenged her she could have walked away. She hadn't. She had stepped forward. And that choice was hers. The days that followed blurred. Reporters began calling, though Bailey shielded her from them. Soldiers whispered her story to recruits at other bases. Letters arrived at the home, some from strangers who called her an inspiration, others warning her family that the military was no place for a child. Read them all, but the words that mattered most weren't in the letters. They were in the silence of her own heart. At night she lay awake, replaying the course in her mind. The walls, the ropes, the mud, the pain, the near falls, the final climb. Each moment etched into her memory not as triumph but as a question. What next? One evening, she stood on the roof of the garage, the mountains etched black against the fatting sky. Pastor Edwards climbed up beside her, settling down with a grunt. "You've been quiet," he said. "I don't feel like I won," admitted. He tilted his head. "Why not?" "Because it wasn't about winning. It wasn't even about Burke. It was about me. And now that it's over, I don't know what comes next." Pastor Edwards was silent for a long time, watching the stars emerge. Finally, he said, "Do you know what dignity is?" She shook her head. "It's when you don't need to shout to be heard, when you don't need to argue to be right. It's when your actions carry the weight of truth, even if no one ever claps. What you did out there wasn't about proving a general wrong. It was about showing the kind of dignity that doesn't speak. It simply acts." The words settled in her like an anchor, not heavy, steady. She thought of the course again, of every obstacle, every bruise. Not as a spectacle, not as a victory, but as a quiet truth she had carried through to the end. The weeks passed. Life at Fort Red Hawk resumed, though now she trained under sharper eyes with higher expectations. At school, whispers never stopped, but she stopped hearing them. At home, her family still worried, but they also stood taller, as though her strength had seeped into their bones. And herself, she changed too. Not in ways that showed on the surface, but in ways that mattered most. She no longer feared being invisible. She no longer feared being seen. She understood that both were burdens, both were gifts. And that strength wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about walking into storms without needing the world's permission. Years later, soldiers who had watched her that day would still tell the story. Some with disbelief, some with awe, but never told it herself. She didn't need to. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories aren't the ones we tell. They're the ones we live. And sometimes, dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts,